Pakistan is home to more than 240 million people, spread across 4 major provinces and dozens of distinct ethnic communities: Punjabis, Sindhis, Pashtuns, Baloch, Kashmiris, Saraikis, Hazaras, and more. For decades, the national narrative has treated this diversity as a single unified whole, bound together under one flag, one founding history, and, since 1947, one shared claim to a homeland carved out of British India. But go back further than 1947, much further, and the region that is now Pakistan sat at the eastern edge of one of history's most consequential civilizations. For over 1,000 years, Persian emperors, administrators, and armies moved through this land. Persian became the language of courts and poetry from Lahore to Delhi. Zoroastrian priests once tended fire temples in valleys that are now part of Pakistan's southwestern frontier. Long before the word Pakistan existed, before Islam arrived in the region, and even before the Mauryan and Gupta empires rose in the Indian heartland to the east, this corridor of land was, in every meaningful political and cultural sense, part of the Persian world. The question scientists set out to answer was whether that ancient connection left more than a linguistic and cultural echo. Did it leave a measurable trace in the DNA of the people living there today? Scientists set out to test something more specific. They took genetic samples from across Pakistan's major ethnic populations and compared them directly against ancient and modern genomes from Iran, the historic heartland of Persia, a civilization that shaped the politics, language, and culture of the entire region for over 2,000 years. The question was simple: which of Pakistan's ethnic populations, if any, actually carries a genetic connection strong enough to be called a true match to ancient Persian ancestry? The answer surprised almost no one who expected diversity, and stunned almost everyone who expected unity. Because when the data came back, only one population in the entire country showed a match close enough to place it genetically inside the same ancestral family as ancient Persia. Every other major group in Pakistan, including some of the country's largest and most politically dominant ethnic communities, showed a measurably different genetic story. This is what scientists found when they finally compared Pakistani DNA to ancient Persia. To understand why this comparison even makes sense to run, you have to understand something about the Iranian Plateau that most people outside the region rarely think about. It has functioned, for tens of thousands of years, as one of the most important crossroads in all of human migration history. Long before Persia existed as a political entity, before the Achaemenid Empire, before Cyrus the Great, before Zoroaster composed the earliest hymns of his new faith, the vast stretch of land connecting Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent was already a corridor through which successive waves of ancient humans moved, settled, mixed, and moved again. Modern population geneticists studying ancient DNA recovered from sites across Iran have traced genetic continuity on this plateau back roughly 3,000 years, from the Copper Age all the way through the Sassanid Empire. But the deeper migratory history embedded in Iranian DNA reaches back tens of thousands of years further still, connecting the region to some of the very first waves of modern humans who moved out of Africa and across Eurasia. When Persia rose as an imperial power, first under the Achaemenids in the 6th century before the Common Era, and later under the Parthians and Sassanids, its influence extended directly into what is now Pakistan. The Achaemenid Empire, at its height, controlled territory reaching into the Indus Valley itself. Persian administrative language, Zoroastrian religious influence, and Persian genetic contact all moved eastward along the same trade routes and military corridors that connected the Iranian Plateau to the northwestern edge of South Asia. If any modern population in Pakistan were going to show a strong genetic echo of that ancient Persian world, geneticists reasoned the evidence should be traceable, assuming, of course, that genetic contact between these regions had been substantial enough and recent enough to leave a measurable signature. The population that showed by far the clearest, most consistent genetic connection to ancient Persia turned out to be the Baloch, the ethnic group native to Balochistan, Pakistan's largest province by land area, stretching along the country's arid southwestern frontier, bordering both Iran and Afghanistan. Multiple independent genetic studies using autosomal DNA, Y chromosome haplogroups, and mitochondrial DNA have converged on the same conclusion. The Baloch population is genetically closest to Iranian, Kurdish, and Pashtun groups, and represents what researchers describe as a fundamentally West Eurasian population, with its primary genetic base rooted directly in ancient Iranian Plateau ancestry. Unlike most other ethnic communities in Pakistan, whose genetic profiles reflect a substantial blend of West Eurasian and South Asian ancestral components, the Baloch show comparatively limited South Asian admixture, meaning their genome, more than almost any other population in the country, still closely resembles the ancient Iranian ancestral population that researchers have traced through thousands of years of continuous genetic study on the plateau itself. The historical record backs this up in remarkable detail. Linguistic and historical evidence suggests the Baloch people migrated eastward into their current homeland from regions closer to the Caspian Sea and northwestern Iran, with much of that migration occurring during the early medieval and late medieval periods. Arabic chronicles from the 10th century already mention the Baloch as a distinct people, and historians point to the Seljuk invasion of Kerman in the 11th century as a major trigger for the eastward migration that eventually brought Baloch communities into the region of modern Pakistan. In other words, this is not simply a case of ancient shared ancestry fading gradually into modern diversity over tens of thousands of years. The Baloch connection to the Iranian Plateau includes a documented, relatively recent historical migration layered on top of a much deeper, shared ancestral base that stretches back to the earliest Iranian Plateau populations themselves. Compare that to Pakistan's other major ethnic groups, and the genetic picture shifts substantially. Pashtun populations, concentrated across Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the country's northwestern border regions, do show meaningful West Eurasian genetic influence, and some studies find Pashtun populations sitting genetically closer to the Balochs and to Iranian populations than most other South Asian groups. But Pashtun ancestry also carries a substantial and well-documented South Asian genetic component, along with additional contributions linked to Central Asian populations moving through the same historic corridors over the centuries, producing a genetic profile that, while sharing real affinities with Iran, is measurably more mixed than the more concentrated Iranian Plateau signature found in Baloch populations specifically. Punjabi populations, as an earlier investigation into Punjab's genetic history revealed in detail, carry their own distinct and heavily layered ancestry, dominated by a combination of ancient Indus Valley farmer lineages and Bronze Age steppe migration, with West Eurasian genetic contribution arriving primarily through Central Asian and Northern Iranian frontier migrations centuries after the core Iranian Plateau lineage had already diverged and settled elsewhere. The genetic signal is real, but it traces back to a different, later chapter of West Eurasian contact, not the same core ancient Iranian population that shaped Baloch ancestry. Sindhi populations, concentrated in Pakistan's southeastern province along the lower Indus River, show yet another distinct genetic profile, generally carrying a higher proportion of indigenous South Asian ancestry compared to Baloch, Pashtun, or Punjabi populations, reflecting the region's deep and largely continuous connection to the ancient Indus Valley civilization that flourished along the same river system more than 4,000 years ago. While Sindh's location along historic trade routes connecting the Arabian Sea to Persia and beyond did bring documented waves of Persian and Middle Eastern contact into the region over the centuries, particularly following the arrival of Islam and the establishment of trade networks linking Sindh's coast to the Persian Gulf. This contact layered on top of, rather than replaced, a genetic base that remains predominantly rooted in deep South Asian ancestry. Hazara populations, found in smaller numbers across parts of Pakistan alongside their much larger community across the border in Afghanistan, present a genuinely distinct case entirely, carrying a substantial East Asian and Central Asian genetic component linked to Mongol and Turkic ancestry, a profile clearly separate from both the core Iranian Plateau signature, found in the Baloch, and the South Asian dominant profiles found among Sindhi and Punjabi populations. Genetic studies comparing Hazara Y chromosome data specifically note this population's distinctiveness from surrounding South Asian and Iranian-related groups, reinforcing just how much ethnic and ancestral variation exists within Pakistan's borders once researchers move beyond broad national-level generalizations. When you line all of these findings up side by side, the result becomes clear and genuinely striking. Among Pakistan's major ethnic populations, only the Baloch show a genetic profile close enough and consistent enough across multiple independent lines of evidence, autosomal DNA, Y chromosome lineages, and historical migration record alike, to be described as a true genetic match to the ancient Iranian Plateau population that Persia itself eventually rose from. Every other major population in the country tells a related but measurably different ancestral story. Pashtun ancestry, blending Iranian-related and South Asian components, Punjabi ancestry, dominated by Indus Valley and Bronze Age, steppe lineages, Sindhi ancestry, rooted primarily in deep indigenous South Asian ancestry, with later Persian trade contact layered on top, and Hazara ancestry, carrying a substantial Central and East Asian genetic signature entirely separate from the Iranian Plateau lineage altogether. This finding carries a certain irony worth sitting with, given the politics of the modern nation these populations all now share. Balochistan, home to the population showing the strongest genetic connection to ancient Persia, is also Pakistan's largest province by territory, and one of its most historically marginalized, both politically and economically, within the modern Pakistani state. The population whose ancestry most directly echoes one of history's great ancient civilizations has, in the modern era, often found itself treated as peripheral to the country's dominant national narrative, a narrative more frequently centered on Punjab, Pakistan's most populous and politically influential province, whose own ancestry, as the genetic evidence shows clearly, actually reflects a different and later chapter of West Eurasian contact, rather than the deep, continuous Iranian Plateau lineage carried by the Baloch. The Y chromosome data adds another layer of precision to this picture, and it's worth walking through what researchers specifically found. Forensic and population genetics, studies analyzing Y STR markers across Baloch communities in Pakistan, have consistently placed them in close statistical proximity to Iranian and broader Southwest Asian reference populations, distinct from the genetic clusters formed by Central Asian, East Asian, and core South Asian reference groups used in the same analyses. When researchers ran discriminant analysis models comparing Baloch samples against reference populations from Central Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia, Baloch genetic profiles consistently sorted closest to the Middle Eastern and Southwest Asian clusters, the same broad genetic neighborhood as modern Iran, rather than clustering with neighboring South Asian populations geographically much closer to them within Pakistan's own borders. That is a genuinely unusual pattern. It means that, in a strictly genetic sense, a Baloch individual living in Quetta may sit closer, ancestry-wise, to a Kurd living in northern Iraq, or Persian living in Isfahan, than to a Punjabi living just a few hundred kilometers away in Lahore, despite sharing a national identity, a currency, and a passport with the latter, and none of those things with the former. The religious history of the region adds further texture to this genetic story, even if it doesn't directly explain it. Long before Islam arrived in South Asia, the Iranian Plateau was the birthplace of Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions, and its influence extended into the Indus Valley region for centuries under Achaemenid and later Sassanid administration. Fire temples, Zoroastrian burial customs, and Persian administrative practices left archaeological traces across parts of what is now Balochistan and Sindh, evidence of sustained cultural and political contact between the Iranian world and the northwestern edge of South Asia stretching back well over 2,000 years. While Zoroastrianism itself did not survive as a majority faith in the region following the later spread of Islam, the genetic evidence suggests that the population most closely tied to that ancient religious and cultural world, the Baloch, also happens to be the population that retained the clearest genetic echo of the ancient Iranian population practicing it. It's worth being precise about what a finding like this does and does not mean. It does not mean the Baloch are somehow more Persian than they are Pakistani, or that other ethnic groups within the country lack meaningful, legitimate historical, and cultural ties of their own to the broader Persian-influenced world that once dominated this entire region's politics, language, and religion for centuries. Persian remained the administrative and literary language of much of South Asia for hundreds of years, shaping vocabulary, poetry, and culture across virtually every ethnic community in modern Pakistan, regardless of their underlying genetic ancestry. Cultural influence and genetic ancestry are not the same measurement, and one does not require the other to be real or significant. What the genetic data does show with unusual clarity is that the deep ancestral roots connecting different Pakistani populations to ancient Persia vary enormously from group to group, and that among all of them, the Baloch stand out as carrying the clearest, most direct, and most thoroughly documented genetic thread back to the ancient population that Persia itself emerged from, thousands of years before the modern borders of Iran or Pakistan were ever drawn on any map. Mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed down independently of the Y chromosome record, adds one more layer of confirmation to this picture, and it comes from a somewhat unexpected direction. Large-scale studies of Iranian mitochondrial genomes have found that Iran itself functions as a genuine genetic bridge, showing detectable maternal genetic connections stretching toward the Arabian Peninsula, the broader Near East, Europe, and notably South Asia and India as well, evidence of both ancient and more recent gene flow moving in multiple directions across the plateau over thousands of years. This matters for the Pakistan comparison, because it confirms that the Iranian Plateau was never a genetically closed or isolated region to begin with. It was porous, connected, and constantly exchanging people in every direction, toward Mesopotamia, toward the Caucasus, and eastward toward the Indus Valley and the population that would eventually become the Baloch. The strength of the Baloch-Iran genetic connection, in other words, isn't simply a matter of two isolated populations happening to look similar. It reflects a documented, centuries-long pattern of exactly the kind of bidirectional contact that Iranian mitochondrial DNA studies have independently confirmed took place across this entire region. One study of Iranian genetic diversity found something particularly relevant to this story almost by accident. Researchers analyzing samples from the Sistani ethnic group, a population native to the Sistan region straddling the modern Iran-Afghanistan-Pakistan border, found that individuals most genetically distant from Iran's central population cluster showed close genetic affinity to Iron Age samples recovered from archaeological sites in Pakistan, suggesting a shared admixture history between border populations on both sides of the modern Iran-Pakistan frontier that predates the political boundary separating them today by well over 2,000 years. This finding echoes, almost precisely, the same pattern researchers found comparing India and Pakistan directly. The deepest genetic connections in this part of the world consistently run through ancient regional corridors, not through the modern national borders that were drawn across them centuries, or in some cases, millennia later. The scientific significance of this finding extends beyond simple curiosity about ancient migration. Understanding which Pakistani populations carry which specific ancestral genetic components has real implications for medical research and public health across the country, since different ancestral backgrounds are associated with different patterns of inherited disease risk, different rates of specific genetic conditions, and different responses to certain medications. A genetic reference database that treats Pakistani as a single uniform category without accounting for the genuinely distinct ancestral profiles of Baloch, Pashtun, Punjabi, Sindhi, and Hazara populations risks producing medical guidance that fits none of these communities particularly well. Researchers increasingly argue that Pakistan's internal genetic diversity deserves the same level of detailed population-specific study that has already reshaped medical genetics research in neighboring India, where national genome sequencing initiatives have worked for years to map exactly this kind of regional and ethnic variation across the country's own remarkably diverse population. There's also a broader historical lesson embedded in this comparison, one that echoes findings from population genetic studies conducted all across the world. Ancient civilizations rarely map cleanly onto modern national borders, and modern national identities rarely map cleanly onto any single ancient ancestral population. Iran itself, when researchers examine its own internal genetic diversity, turns out to be far from a single uniform population. Modern Iranian genetic studies covering major ethnic groups including Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Balochis, Lurs, and Turkmen reveal a country whose own population carries multiple distinct ancestral threads, shaped by thousands of years of migration and contact across a plateau that has always functioned as a crossroads rather than an isolated homeland. The Baloch population straddling the modern Iran-Pakistan-Afghanistan border region sits, quite literally, at the center of that ancient crossroads, which may be precisely why their genetic ancestry preserves such a clear and consistent echo of the deep Iranian Plateau lineage that once gave rise to one of history's great civilizations. There's a final layer to this story worth sitting with, and it has less to do with ancient migration than with the modern politics still playing out across the region today. Balochistan remains one of the most restive and contested provinces in modern Pakistan, home to a decades-long separatist movement, recurring conflict between Baloch nationalist groups and the Pakistani state, and long-standing grievances over the province's share of resource revenue despite its vast reserves of natural gas and minerals. None of that political reality is caused by or resolved by genetic ancestry. Political grievances are built from economics, governance, and lived history, not from Y-chromosome haplogroups. But it is a striking irony that the population carrying the clearest genetic thread back to one of history's most storied ancient civilizations is also the population that has, within the modern nation-state built partly in the name of shared South Asian Muslim identity, most persistently found itself on the political periphery. Genetics does not settle political disputes, and no responsible scientist studying this data would suggest otherwise. But it does add an unexpected layer of historical irony to a conflict that, on the surface, has always been framed in purely modern political and economic terms. It's also worth noting how this finding fits into the broader pattern that keeps surfacing across every population genetics study conducted on this region, from the India-Pakistan comparison to the 10-region survey of Indian DNA to this investigation into Pakistan's Persian ancestry. Again and again, the deepest, most consistent genetic connections found by researchers run along ancient geographic and migratory corridors, river valleys, mountain passes, trade routes, and plateau crossings, rather than along the modern political borders drawn across South and West Asia over the past century. The Baloch-Iran connection is simply the clearest, most dramatic example yet of a pattern that, by now, should feel entirely familiar. Modern nations are recent inventions, built rapidly across the 20th century, while the genetic history running underneath them was written slowly, patiently, and largely independently of whatever flag would eventually fly above it. That is the result that emerged when scientists finally ran the comparison directly. Not that Pakistan lacks a connection to ancient Persia, and not that the country's dominant historical narratives about Persian cultural influence were somehow wrong, but that the specific, measurable genetic thread connecting modern Pakistani populations to that ancient civilization runs through one population far more clearly than through any other. In a country built from dozens of distinct ethnic communities, each carrying its own deep and separate migratory history, only the Baloch carry a genome that still, after thousands of years, reads unmistakably as a direct continuation of the ancient world that once called this entire region Persia.